Another another strategy of identifying use cases for testing purposes is to use charting. That we would like to be able to identify what are the different states that the application could be, right, and then represent them graphically, perhaps as nodes, and see what are the different actions and events that cause the application to transition from one state to the next. This is not only this is a good idea for implementing and deriving tests, it's also a good idea to as an opportunity for developers to perhaps challenge the requirements, as making perhaps no sense, that might be perhaps contradictory. That when you try to implement test cases to validate certain inputs and certain behaviors, you find yourself that you are implementing things that are actually contradictory from one another. And so remember that that requirements are not set in stone, right? That at any point in the life cycle of a software, your responsibility is always to challenge the requirements. That they're vague, they might be contradictory, that they're not clear, right? Just as you've been doing with the assignments, right? You should always look for clarification and come up with a solution on how is that what is meant by something that might be contradictory. It might be at each level. It might be at the use case level that is challenging a particular business requirement. It might be at the functional requirements that might be challenging a use case or challenging a user requirement. Or it might be even down here where we're actually implementing something at the code, and it just makes we're trying to validate something and write a test which challenges a particular assumption at the use case level or at the functional requirements level. Right. So at every point, our responsibility is always to challenge, right, a particular requirement at any level of the life cycle. UML State Charts are very useful for representing the different states that the application might be in and the different events that or actions that the user might take that cause the application to transition. And so this gives opportunities to also identify tests, to verify that if I put the application at a particular state and I cause a particular transition, does it actually transition to this other state? Right, so that's a valid test that we would need to consider. Another useful application of charts is to document the navigation of an application as you go from one screen to the next, as the user generates an event of streams and cause the application to transition from one screen to the next. And we can document this using navigation charts. Typically, these would be formally represented as nodes, and what are the different screens, all the different screens that represent your application. We did a little bit of this last week when we introduced user interfaces, right, and looked at the transitions of navigating from the profile to the administration page to all the different places, right? So it would be a formal way of representing all the different possibilities of navigating across your application. Here's just an example of what that chart might look like. It's also useful for representing when an application is in a particular mode, right? As a user interacts with the application might enter a particular mode, and different inputs are interpreted in a different way in a particular mode. Right, so you have to identify what are all those modes and all the tests that apply for that particular mode. Right, so you need to. That would be also a useful way of identifying different use cases. For instance, here's an example of again the example of our charter company, where depending on the number of guests, the application might treat the charter in 3 different ways. Right, if it's less than 6 guests, if it's more than 6 guests, if it's more than 12 guests. The application would treat the charter as in different modalities, as a time charter, a demise charter, or as an invalid charter. It can be represented in a transition diagram as such, right? That transition the application in different ways. Again, this can be used for identifying what the tests might be that would cause the transitions between the application going from one state to another state. As the tests are executed, they will, some of them will hopefully most of them will pass, some of them will fail, or things that used to pass perhaps no longer pass, right? And now they're failing. Somebody introduced some problem into the application. So more and more, we're going to ask you going forward to record these defects, right? Either within your team, right? If you identify something is wrong or something that used to work but no longer works, we're going to be asking you to identify these bugs, these defects, right? And create a JIRA bug, right? And either assign it to somebody if you know who's responsible for this, or at least leave it in the backlog, right? So that come next sprint, right? The first thing that one of the first things at sprint planning, the Scrum Master along with the team can groom the backlog and identify some of the bugs that have been accumulating over the last couple of sprints and decide to fix these bugs, right? Sometimes depending on the severity of the bug, it might not be scheduled into a particular sprint, or if it's a blocker bug because it's blocking everybody else. Somebody broke the build, right, and nobody can do anything until the build is fixed. It might be drop everything you're doing. This is what we're doing. We're fixing this going forward. So what we're going to be asking you from now on, going forward, is to record these defects and assign them or leave them in the backlog. Okay. Now, when you do record these defects, we'll ask you to please be as verbose as possible. If you even have a clue on what might be the problem, right? Maybe even a link to a particular line of code you think what the problem might be, right? That'd be as useful as possible, right? So and also any particular steps that you were following to reproduce that problem, right? That as useful as you can. Even snapshots, screenshots of the problem or even a video of that documents what is that you're doing, so that give as much clue to the person as possible that is going to work on this. Now there might be even sprints that depending on how many bugs we have been accumulating, any technical debt that we have been accumulating, we might only do bug fixes, right? And says we're not going to be implementing any new features until we empty out all the bugs, right? Oftentimes we refer to these as like a hardening sprint. We're going to harden the what's already implemented, right? And pay down any technical debt that we have been accruing throughout several sprints, right?